My son said, "My wife comes first now. I can't keep choosing you over her anymore." I stayed calm. He had no idea what he had just given up. Before you scroll past this, thinking it's just another family disagreement, stay with me until the end, and tell me in the comments which city you're listening from, because this moment, this sentence, changes everything in ways most people don't see until it's too late. He said it standing in his kitchen, arms crossed, voice steady like he'd practiced it. Not angry, not apologetic, just resolved, as if choosing between his wife and his mother was a burden he'd finally decided to set down. And I remember noticing how calm he looked, how certain, how relieved, like saying it out loud had lifted something off his chest. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind him of the years I spent putting him first. I didn't argue about what choosing really meant. I simply looked at him and nodded. Because in that moment I understood something he didn't, that calm acceptance can be more final than any argument. He blinked, clearly expecting resistance, maybe even tears, and when none came, he rushed to fill the silence, explaining that marriage required priorities, that his wife needed to feel secure, that he was tired of being caught in the middle. Phrases people use when they want approval for a decision they've already made, and I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I was already stepping out of the role he'd assigned me, the one where I was supposed to compete, justify, or quietly lose. I picked up my bag, thanked him for being honest, and watched confusion flicker across his face, because he couldn't understand why I wasn't fighting to be chosen. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly realize standing there so sure of himself, was that by declaring who came first, he'd also declared who he was willing to lose. And if you stay with me, you'll see why staying calm wasn't weakness. It was the moment the balance quietly shifted against him. The drive home after that conversation felt longer than usual, not because of traffic or distance, but because my mind was replaying years I had never questioned until that moment. And if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because this wasn't a story that began with his wife or that sentence in his kitchen. It began long before he learned how to frame choices as obligations. I raised my son to be independent, to build his own life, to choose a partner who made him happy, and when he married, I truly believed there was room for everyone. Not equal space, but respectful space, the kind that doesn't require competition. I never asked to come first. I never expected to be chosen over anyone. I simply believed I wouldn't be quietly demoted for convenience. My life before all of this was steady, predictable in a way that comes from knowing who you are. I lived alone, managed my own affairs, stayed busy with work and commitments that mattered to me. I wasn't lingering at the edges of his life waiting to be invited in. I showed up when asked. I stepped back when needed, and for a long time, that balance seemed to work, or at least I told myself it did, because it was easier than questioning subtle discomfort. Looking back now, I can see the early signs I dismissed. The way conversations changed when his wife entered the room, the way my opinions were acknowledged politely and then ignored, the way plans were discussed around me instead of with me. Small shifts that felt too minor to challenge but significant enough to register. I told myself this was normal, that families evolve, that marriage changes dynamics, and it does. But change doesn't require erasure, and that distinction matters. There were moments I remember clearly now, times I laughed off comments about being old-fashioned, times I adjusted my schedule so I wouldn't disrupt theirs, times I accepted last-minute cancellations without complaint because I didn't want to be seen as demanding, and each compromise felt reasonable in isolation, but together, they formed a pattern, one where my presence was tolerated rather than valued. And if you're listening right now and recognizing yourself in that pattern, stay with me, because I didn't see it clearly either until it was already well established. My son would talk about how hard it was to balance everyone's expectations, how he felt torn, how he just wanted peace, and I listened sympathetically, never once framing myself as part of the problem, because I wasn't causing scenes or making demands. I was simply there, and that was enough to be inconvenient. Over time, I noticed how often choosing became part of the language, as if love were a zero-sum equation, as if caring for one person required withdrawing from another, and that idea settled into his thinking without challenge, reinforced by the belief that adulthood meant cutting ties cleanly instead of maintaining them thoughtfully. I trusted him to navigate that balance with integrity, trusted that he knew the difference between prioritizing a marriage and discarding a parent, and that trust is what allowed things to progress as far as they did, because trust, when unexamined, can be mistaken for permission. My life during those years remained full, not centered on him, but connected to him in a way I believed was mutual. Phone calls, shared milestones, small traditions that didn't feel intrusive. And yet, slowly, I became more cautious, measuring my words, limiting my presence, preemptively removing myself so no one would have to ask, and that self-editing is a warning sign people rarely recognize in themselves. It feels like maturity, like respect, like understanding, but it often signals fear of being unwanted. I never said that fear out loud, not to friends, not to myself, because saying it would have forced me to confront the possibility that I was already being edged out. And when he finally said it plainly, that his wife came first and he couldn't keep choosing me, it didn't land as betrayal, it landed as confirmation. Confirmation that the quiet adjustments I'd been making hadn't protected the relationship at all. They'd simply made my removal easier, and that realization stayed with me as I pulled into my driveway that night, sitting in the car with the engine off. Understanding that the story I'd been telling myself about patience and understanding had allowed a different story to take hold, one where my place was conditional, my presence optional, and my calm acceptance expected. But what he couldn't see, what he hadn't considered in that moment of certainty, was that the balance he thought he was choosing had been supported by more than he realized, by a presence that didn't demand credit but provided stability. And if you stay with me, you'll see how the life he believed would become simpler without me began revealing just how much had quietly depended on the very thing he'd decided to give up. After that conversation in his kitchen, nothing dramatic happened right away. And if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because what came next was far more revealing than any argument could have been. The shift wasn't announced, it was felt, subtle at first, like the air changing before a storm. Phone calls became shorter, not colder, just efficient, updates delivered without detail, questions answered without curiosity in return, and I noticed how often conversations ended with phrases like, "We'll see," or "We'll figure it out later," language that closes doors politely while pretending they're still open. I wasn't invited less often at first. I was invited differently, last minute, conditional, framed as optional in a way that made declining feel expected. And I declined more often than not out of spite, but because I could feel my presence being tolerated rather than welcomed. And if you're listening right now, and that distinction sounds familiar, you know how heavy it is. It's the moment you realize you're being managed, not included. His wife became more visible in these decisions without ever speaking directly to me. Plans shifted because she was tired. Schedules changed because it would be easier. Boundaries appeared fully formed, without discussion, and my son relayed them like a mediator who'd already chosen a side but didn't want to admit it. He'd say things like, "She just needs consistency," or "I'm trying to keep things calm," as if calm were a fragile object that might shatter if my name was mentioned too loudly. And I listened, nodded, adjusted, because adjustment had become my reflex. I told myself I was being understanding, that this was what respect looked like, but understanding that only moves in one direction isn't respect. It's erasure. I began noticing how often decisions were made without me that affected me directly. Holidays planned without asking whether I'd be alone. Schedules finalized assuming I'd accommodate. Expectations set about my availability without confirmation. And when I gently asked about it once, just once, my son looked surprised, then slightly irritated. Like the question itself had disrupted something delicate. He said, "We didn't think it would matter." And that sentence stayed with me, because it revealed more than he intended. My presence didn't matter enough to check. My absence didn't matter enough to notice. And if you're listening right now and feeling that sting, stay. Because this is the point where many people begin doubting themselves instead of the situation. I wondered if I was being too sensitive, too rigid, too proud. I replayed conversations in my head, searching for moments where I might have caused tension without realizing it. And that self-examination kept me quiet longer than it should have, because when you're busy auditing your own behavior, you're not questioning someone else's assumptions. The exclusions continued, small but consistent. A family gathering I heard about after it happened, a decision made for everyone that hadn't included me. A comment about how things were easier now, said casually, without malice, but with finality. And that was when I understood something important. Ease had become their metric. Not fairness, not connection, not consideration, just ease. And ease often demands the removal of whatever introduces complexity, even if that complexity is a person. My son didn't confront me, didn't accuse me, didn't argue. He simply adjusted his life around my gradual disappearance. And I let him, because I needed to see it clearly before I responded to it. I needed to know whether this was temporary discomfort or a permanent redefinition, and clarity arrived the day I realized I was no longer part of their future planning at all. Not hypothetically, not emotionally, but practically. Plans discussed years out that didn't include any version of me, as if I existed only in the present tense, useful when convenient, irrelevant otherwise. And if you're listening right now, understand this. Being erased slowly is often more destabilizing than being rejected outright, because it trains you to accept less without ever being told you're losing something. And that's exactly what had been happening. My calm acceptance in the kitchen hadn't de-escalated anything. It had confirmed an assumption they already held, that I would adjust without consequence, that I would make room by making myself smaller. And as that realization settled in, something shifted inside me. Not anger, not grief, but resolve. Because once you see a pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you stop participating in your own erasure, the dynamic has no choice but to change, whether the people benefiting from it are ready or not. And if you stay with me, you'll see how that quiet resolve, formed without confrontation, became the foundation for everything that followed, not as retaliation, but as inevitability. It didn't come as an argument or an explosion. It arrived as a decision already settled. And if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because this was the moment the quiet erasure became official. My son called and asked if we could talk, not urgently, not emotionally, just firmly enough to signal that this wasn't a conversation meant to change anything. When I arrived, his wife was already there, seated at the table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, posture calm, composed, like someone attending a meeting rather than speaking to family. There was no preamble, no checking in, no warmth to soften what came next. He said it the same way he had before, but with more certainty this time. My wife comes first now. And then the sentence that followed carried the weight. I can't keep choosing you over her anymore. As if choosing were something he'd been burdened with, as if my presence had forced him into a competition I never entered. He looked at me after he said it, watching closely, expecting resistance, justification, something to prove that the decision was necessary. And when I didn't give him any of that, when I stayed calm, his certainty wavered just enough to reveal how much he needed my reaction to validate his choice. He began explaining himself, carefully, using words like boundaries and responsibility and commitment, phrases that sound principled when they're spoken slowly, but function as shields when they're used to avoid accountability. He said marriage requires loyalty, that prioritizing his wife didn't mean rejecting me, that this was about balance, and I listened, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear how far he'd taken this narrative, how completely he'd convinced himself that exclusion was the same as maturity. His wife finally spoke then, her voice measured, controlled, saying they needed clarity, that ambiguity had been stressful, that drawing a firm line was healthier for everyone, and that was when it became clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reclassification. I wasn't being disagreed with. I was being reassigned, moved from family member to variable, something to be managed rather than included. I asked one question, quietly, "What does choosing look like to you?" And my son hesitated, eyes flicking to his wife before answering, a pause long enough to tell the truth without words, because choices framed as moral decisions often hide simpler motives: avoidance, convenience, relief. He said choosing meant protecting his marriage from tension, from outside pressure, from expectations that made things complicated. And there it was. Complexity was the enemy. Not conflict, not harm, just complexity. And my existence, even silent, even careful, represented complexity. He didn't want to manage anymore. I nodded, because arguing would have turned me into exactly what they needed me to be, to justify the decision. Emotional, difficult, disruptive. I thanked them for being honest, stood up, and gathered my things, and the relief in the room was immediate, palpable, like a held breath released. And that relief told me everything. They hadn't been afraid of hurting me. They'd been afraid of dealing with uncertainty, and removing me had resolved that, at least temporarily. My son followed me to the door, still talking, still trying to soften the impact, saying things like, "This doesn't mean forever, and we just need time," promises designed to keep the door emotionally ajar without committing to reopening it. And I listened, without responding, because timelines without terms aren't commitments, they're placeholders. And as I stepped outside, I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. By staying calm, by not protesting, by refusing to compete for a position I never sought, I had removed myself from the narrative he needed to feel righteous. He didn't get to cast me as the unreasonable mother who couldn't accept his marriage. Instead, he was left with the reality of his choice unmirrored, unchallenged, and that unsettled him more than any argument could have. Because certainty needs opposition to feel earned. I drove home slowly, not replaying the conversation, but examining it, noticing what wasn't said. No mention of how my absence would affect me, no question about my needs, no acknowledgement of what was being lost, only an assumption that calm acceptance meant agreement, and that assumption was their mistake. Because acceptance isn't consent, and silence isn't surrender. I didn't leave that house feeling rejected. I left feeling clarified about where I stood and what that position required of me going forward. Because once someone tells you they can't keep choosing you, what they're really telling you is that they've decided your place without you. And from that moment on, the only real choice left is how you respond. And if you stay with me, you'll see how choosing not to fight in that moment wasn't passive. It was preparatory, the beginning of a shift they didn't anticipate. One that would make them confront the difference between prioritizing a marriage and erasing a person. Not emotionally, but practically, in ways that can't be undone once set in motion. After that meeting, after the line had been drawn so cleanly it almost looked reasonable, I began to understand what choosing his wife actually meant in practice. And if you're still listening right now, stay, because this is where the language fell apart, and the behavior told the truth. Choosing her didn't look like protecting a marriage from harm. It looked like simplifying his life by removing anything that required emotional effort beyond agreement. It looked like avoiding difficult conversations by reframing them as loyalty tests. It looked like mistaking compliance for peace and distance for maturity. My son didn't suddenly become cruel. He became efficient, and efficiency is often mistaken for growth, when it's really just avoidance with better vocabulary. He stopped asking questions that might complicate things, stopped checking in beyond surface-level updates, stopped engaging in any conversation where disagreement could arise, because disagreement now carried a price he wasn't willing to pay, and that price was tension at home, so he paid it elsewhere instead. Quietly, by withdrawing from me, his wife benefited from this arrangement without having to demand it directly, because the system rewarded her comfort automatically. My discomfort didn't factor into the equation. And if you're listening right now, understand this. When someone says they're choosing peace, ask yourself, whose peace is being protected and whose is being sacrificed? The answer is usually revealing. I began noticing how often his justifications changed, depending on the audience. With me, it was about boundaries and balance. With others, it was about being a good husband, about not wanting drama, about growing up. Narratives shift when the goal isn't truth but validation. And he needed validation badly, because on some level, he knew the choice wasn't as noble as he wanted it to be. He'd frame it as inevitability, saying things like, "This is just how marriage works," as if marriage were a uniform experience rather than a set of negotiated values, and that generalization did a lot of work for him. It absolved him of responsibility by turning his personal decision into a cultural rule, and rules feel safer than choices, because rules can't be questioned without seeming unreasonable. I watched how he leaned into that framing, how often he repeated it, and repetition is another clue. People repeat what they're trying to convince themselves of, not what they're certain about. His wife reinforced it indirectly through comments about stress, about needing alignment, about how hard it is when outside voices interfere, never naming me, never confronting me directly, because indirect pressure is harder to challenge. It leaves no single statement to refute, just an atmosphere that demands adjustment, and my son adjusted eagerly, because adjustment felt like action without confrontation, and confrontation scared him. Not because he lacked courage, but because courage often requires accepting discomfort, and discomfort was exactly what he was trying to eliminate. I realized then that choosing her wasn't about love, it was about control, not her controlling him necessarily, but him controlling his environment, minimizing variables, narrowing his emotional field until only agreeable elements remained. And I didn't fit neatly into that field anymore, not because I caused chaos, but because I represented history, obligation, nuance, all the things you can't manage with a simple rule. I noticed how he talked about me to others now, cautiously, vaguely, positioning me as someone who didn't quite understand, someone who was having a hard time adjusting, language that softened his role while subtly undermining mine. And that language mattered, because it laid the groundwork for future decisions to be framed as necessary consequences rather than chosen actions. And if you're listening right now, stay, because this is how people prepare narratives long before they need them. I didn't confront him about it, not because I didn't care, but because I was watching the pattern complete itself. I wanted to see how far he would go in redefining me to justify his comfort. And the answer came quietly, in moments where I was excluded not for any stated reason, but simply because inclusion required explanation, and explanation had become too expensive. Birthdays acknowledged late, plans mentioned in passing after they'd already happened, decisions shared as updates rather than discussions, and each time, the same underlying message surfaced: this is easier without you. And what struck me most was how convinced he was that ease equaled correctness, that the absence of immediate conflict meant he'd made the right choice. He didn't see the cost accumulating beneath the surface, the way removing one stabilizing relationship often increases pressure on the remaining ones, the way emotional labor doesn't disappear when you redistribute it. It concentrates, and concentration eventually creates strain. His marriage began carrying expectations it hadn't been designed to support alone, because no single relationship should have to absorb every role, buffer every stress, validate every decision. And if you're listening right now, you may already know where this leads, because systems built on exclusion tend to collapse inward. But at that stage, he still believed he'd simplified his life, still believed he'd chosen wisely, still believed he'd traded complexity for peace. And he hadn't yet realized what he'd actually given up. Not my presence, not my support, but the quiet margin that had allowed his life to feel manageable in the first place, the margin that doesn't announce itself until it's gone. And as I observed all of this, calmly, deliberately, something else became clear to me. I didn't need to argue against his choice. I needed to respond to its reality. Because when someone tells you who they're willing to sideline for convenience, they're also telling you how they'll behave when stakes rise. And that information isn't meant to be debated, it's meant to be used. And if you stay with me, you'll see how I began doing exactly that. Not to punish, not to retaliate, but to align my life with the truth he'd finally made explicit. What my son never asked, never even considered, was what I had been quietly holding together long before he decided his life would be easier without me. And if you're still listening right now, stay, because this is where the balance began to shift, in ways he couldn't see yet. I had never advertised my role in his stability, not because it wasn't significant, but because I believed support didn't need applause. Over the years, I'd become the margin in his life, the unseen buffer that absorbed pressure without announcing itself. I was the one he called when plans fell apart, when schedules collided, when decisions needed a sounding board that wouldn't judge or escalate. I was the person who noticed what he missed, who remembered dates, handled logistics, smoothed misunderstandings before they became conflicts. Not dramatically, not visibly, just consistently. And consistency creates an illusion of permanence. People assume what has always been there, always will be, until it isn't. When he told me he couldn't keep choosing me, he assumed the only thing he was giving up was emotional proximity. Occasional visits, polite conversations. He didn't realize that proximity had never been the point. Function had been, and function doesn't announce its absence until the strain appears elsewhere. I didn't confront him with this. I didn't list what I'd done or warn him about what would change, because warnings invite negotiation, and negotiation would have placed me back into a role I'd already outgrown. Instead, I adjusted quietly, methodically. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been expressed, stopped filling gaps that hadn't been acknowledged, stopped making myself available by default, not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. Because once someone declares you optional, you have no obligation to continue acting essential. The first thing to go unnoticed was the silence. Fewer calls, fewer updates, fewer casual check-ins, and he mistook that silence for compliance, for acceptance, for peace. But silence isn't absence, it's space, and space reveals pressure points. Small issues that had once been diffused began resurfacing. Scheduling conflicts that had previously resolved themselves now required negotiation. Misunderstandings that would have been smoothed quietly lingered longer than necessary. And if you're listening right now, understand this. Support systems don't vanish dramatically, they fade, and their absence is felt indirectly, as friction, as fatigue, as a sense that everything takes more effort than it used to. My son mentioned being tired more often, overwhelmed, stretched thin, comments delivered casually, without accusation, because he hadn't yet connected the dots. His wife responded by tightening control, planning more rigidly, managing more aggressively, because when informal support disappears, people often compensate with structure. But structure without flexibility creates its own stress, and that stress began showing up in their interactions. Sharper tones, shorter patience, decisions made quickly to avoid discussion, and all of it reinforced my earlier realization. They hadn't chosen peace, they'd chosen simplicity, and simplicity is brittle, it doesn't bend well under pressure. I continued my own life during this time, not dramatically different, but more deliberate. I redirected energy I'd once held in reserve toward myself, projects I'd postponed, relationships I'd maintained quietly, routines that didn't revolve around being available, and that shift grounded me, because I wasn't reacting to exclusion anymore, I was responding to reality. My son eventually noticed changes he couldn't name. He asked once whether everything was okay, a vague question that didn't invite specifics, and I answered honestly that I was fine, that I was busy, that I was doing well, and my calm unsettled him, because calm without access feels like distance, and distance is harder to manage than conflict. He didn't press, because pressing would have required acknowledging the boundary he'd created, and acknowledging it would have forced him to confront its consequences. Instead, he adapted, at first, juggling responsibilities, absorbing stress, telling himself this was what adulthood looked like, that this was normal, and that belief sustained him for a while. Until it didn't, until the accumulation of small frictions became impossible to ignore. His wife began expressing frustration more openly, not about me, but about everything else, about the workload, the expectations, the constant feeling of being on edge. And he listened, trying to fix it, because that's what he'd committed to doing, but the fixes didn't hold, because they addressed symptoms, not structure, and the structure had changed when he removed a stabilizing element without replacing it. And if you're listening right now, stay, because this is where many people expect a turning point, an apology, a realization. But those things require self-awareness, and self-awareness often arrives late, if at all. What arrived instead was strain, persistent, quiet, cumulative, the kind that doesn't explode but erodes, and that erosion forced choices he hadn't anticipated, not about me, but about his own capacity, his own limits, his own assumptions about what he could handle alone. And through all of this, I remained steady, not because I was indifferent, but because I'd stopped managing outcomes that weren't mine to manage. I'd given him exactly what he'd asked for without realizing it, a life where he didn't have to choose me. And in doing so, I'd also given him something else, the full weight of the choice he'd made, unbuffered, unsoftened, and unavoidable. And if you stay with me, you'll see how that weight, once fully felt, began to change the way he looked at everything he thought he'd secured by letting me go. The cost of that choice didn't arrive as punishment or drama. It arrived as pressure, steady and unrelenting. And if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because this is where the illusion of peace finally began to fracture. My son had believed that by choosing his wife first, everything else would fall into place naturally, that clarity would replace tension, that loyalty would simplify decisions. But what actually happened was far less romantic. The responsibilities he'd once shared informally now rested squarely on his shoulders. Every decision heavier, because there was no longer a quiet place to set it down. His wife began leaning on him more, not maliciously, not consciously, but inevitably, because when one support pillar is removed, the remaining ones absorb the weight, and that weight changes people. He sounded different on the phone. When he called at all, less confident, more hurried, conversations filled with small complaints disguised as jokes, remarks about being exhausted, about how nothing seemed to slow down anymore. And I listened, not offering solutions, not stepping in, because stepping in would have contradicted the reality he'd chosen. And if you're listening right now, understand this: consequences don't need to be announced to be effective. They simply unfold when patterns are left uninterrupted. His marriage, the one he'd protected so carefully from discomfort, began carrying expectations it couldn't satisfy on its own. Not because it was weak, but because no single relationship can replace an entire support network without strain. Disagreements that once would have dissipated quietly now lingered, unresolved, because there was no neutral space to process them. My son tried harder, took on more, said yes more often, and the more he did, the more was expected, because accommodation, once established, becomes baseline, and baseline always rises. His wife began expressing frustration more openly, not about me, but about life, about feeling overwhelmed, about how everything seemed harder than it should be, and my son internalized that frustration as responsibility, because that's what he'd committed to when he framed his choice as loyalty. He believed it was his job to absorb the stress so she wouldn't have to, and absorbing stress without release leads to erosion, not explosion, erosion of patience, of empathy, of clarity, and that erosion showed up in subtle ways: sharper words, quicker defensiveness, decisions made to end conversations rather than resolve them, and all of it contradicted the peace he'd been so certain he was securing. I noticed how rarely he laughed now, how often he sounded distracted, how conversations circled the same complaints without resolution, and still, he didn't connect this to the choice he'd made, because people rarely trace consequences back to decisions they're emotionally invested in defending. It's easier to believe circumstances changed than to accept that the structure you chose couldn't support the load. I heard about missed obligations, strained friendships, moments where he felt caught again, but this time without an outlet, without a place to speak freely. And that irony wasn't lost on me. He'd said he was tired of being in the middle, but by narrowing his world, he'd placed himself squarely at the center of everything, responsible for maintaining balance without assistance. And if you're listening right now, stay, because this is where many people expect regret to surface. But regret requires perspective, and perspective is hard to access when you're busy surviving the consequences of your own certainty. My son didn't apologize, didn't reach out to reconnect. Instead, he doubled down, convincing himself this strain was temporary, that once things settled, the peace would come. But peace that depends on constant effort isn't peace. It's maintenance. And maintenance without relief becomes resentment, not always outwardly expressed, but internally stored. I could hear it in his pauses, in the way he spoke about obligations, in how often he used the word should. Language of duty rather than choice. And duty, when divorced from agency, drains people quickly. His wife sensed the shift too, responding by tightening expectations, because insecurity often seeks control, and control increased the strain rather than easing it, creating a cycle neither of them had anticipated. And throughout all of this, I remained where I was, steady, unchanged, not intervening, not rescuing, not reminding him of what had been lost, because reminders would have softened the lesson, and lessons that are softened rarely land. What landed instead was reality, unavoidable and impersonal, the reality that removing a stabilizing presence doesn't eliminate the need it fulfilled, it redistributes it, often unevenly. And if you stay with me, you'll see how that redistribution forced my son into a reckoning he hadn't planned for. Not with me, but with the limits of the choice he'd defended so confidently. A reckoning that would push him toward actions he never imagined he'd need to take once he believed he'd finally chosen correctly. When the strain stopped being manageable, they didn't name it as strain, and if you're still listening right now, stay, because this is where pressure turns into strategy. My son didn't come to me with an apology or an admission. He came with concern, carefully worded, rehearsed enough to sound reasonable. He asked how I was doing, whether I was lonely, whether I had enough support, questions that might have sounded caring to an outsider, but carried a different weight to someone who'd already seen the pattern. Because concern framed after exclusion often isn't about care, it's about control. He suggested we talk more, meet occasionally, just to stay connected. And the phrasing mattered. Not reconnect, not repair, just stay connected. A low-commitment arrangement that preserved access without restoring respect, and I listened without agreeing, because agreement would have blurred the boundary he'd insisted on drawing. His wife followed a different approach, indirect but deliberate. She reached out once, not to address what had happened, but to reset the tone. Messages about how hard things had been lately, how everyone was stressed, how misunderstandings happen when people don't communicate enough. Language that redistributed responsibility evenly without acknowledging where it had been unilaterally exercised. And if you're listening right now, understand this. When people escalate softly, it's because hard escalation failed or feels risky. They're testing whether guilt will work where authority didn't. I didn't engage emotionally. I responded politely, briefly, because politeness maintains dignity without reopening negotiations. And that restraint frustrated them more than resistance would have. My son began mentioning how others were worried about me, how distance wasn't healthy, how isolation could be dangerous. Subtle implications wrapped in care, and this was the moment I recognized the shift clearly. They weren't trying to reconnect as equals, they were trying to reframe my boundaries as a problem, because boundaries that can be pathologized can be overridden. And that realization sharpened everything. I documented conversations, noted language, timelines, not obsessively, but deliberately, because escalation leaves tracks, and people who escalate quietly often believe those tracks won't be noticed. The next step came cloaked in neutrality, a suggestion that I speak to someone, a professional, just to check in. My son said, as if the idea had occurred to him spontaneously, as if it weren't the logical extension of months spent redefining me as difficult without naming the cause. And if you're listening right now, stay, because this is where many people are caught off guard. Systems designed to protect can be misused when narratives are framed carefully enough. I didn't refuse outright. I asked questions. Who suggested it? What concerns had been raised? What exactly needed to be assessed? And my son hesitated. Not long. Just enough to reveal that the concern wasn't mine. It was theirs. Concern about how to manage the situation without revisiting the choice they'd made. And when I declined politely, explaining that I was well, supported, and capable, the tone shifted again, impatience leaking through reassurance. His wife accused me of being stubborn, of making things harder than they needed to be. And there it was, the familiar refrain, ease over equity, convenience over consent. They didn't want reconciliation, they wanted compliance, and compliance required redefining my refusal as irrational. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself emotionally, because emotion would have validated their framing. Instead, I remained factual, calm, consistent, and consistency is difficult to undermine without escalation. Days passed, then weeks. The attempts continued, alternating between warmth and pressure, inclusion and implication, a pattern designed to exhaust rather than convince. And if you're listening right now, understand this. Escalation often isn't loud. It's persistent. It wears people down by making resistance feel socially costly. I felt the weight of that, not because I doubted myself, but because pressure, even when recognized, still applies force. And through it all, I held my ground, not defiantly, not dramatically, just firmly, because firmness doesn't need volume, and that firmness forced their hand. They couldn't reclaim the old dynamic quietly, and they weren't ready to confront it openly. So they hovered in between, frustrated, uncertain, probing for weaknesses. And that uncertainty began affecting everything else. Conversations between them grew sharper, decisions more rushed, because unresolved power struggles don't stay contained. They bleed outward, and I could hear the strain in my son's voice now. Not just tired, but unsettled, as if the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd believed, and that was the consequence they hadn't anticipated. Escalation that doesn't succeed, doesn't just fail, it destabilizes the person attempting it, because it forces them to confront the limits of their influence. And if you stay with me, you'll see how that destabilization, once set in motion, led to a reckoning neither of them expected, one that wouldn't be resolved by persuasion, pressure, or reframing, but by loss, quiet, cumulative, and irreversible. They didn't lose everything at once, and if you're still listening right now, stay, because what they lost first wasn't tangible. It was credibility, the kind that quietly shapes how people respond to you long before you notice it slipping away. It began subtly, conversations with extended family that felt different, questions asked more carefully, pauses where agreement used to be automatic. My son sensed it but couldn't name it. He mentioned feeling misunderstood, like people were reading too much into things. A phrase people use when the narrative they've been relying on stops working, because once a story has been told too many times without aligning with observable reality, it starts to feel thin, and thin stories don't hold weight. Friends who had once taken his side instinctively now listened without affirming. Co-workers responded more neutrally, not hostile, just less invested, and that shift unsettled him more than open criticism would have. Because neutrality removes leverage, his wife felt it too. Invitations slowed, enthusiasm cooled. People who once deferred now asked questions, and questions are dangerous when your position depends on being unquestioned. I didn't point any of this out. I didn't need to. Consequences that are noticed internally are far more powerful than those announced externally. Professionally, the ripple continued. Nothing overt, no accusations, just increased scrutiny. Decisions revisited, judgments double-checked. Trust recalibrated. Because when someone demonstrates a willingness to override personal boundaries for convenience, that behavior doesn't stay contained within family life. People extrapolate. They always do. My son began expressing frustration about how everything felt harder now, how he had to explain himself more, how assumptions that used to work in his favor didn't anymore. And he blamed circumstances, timing, stress, never the choice itself, because acknowledging that would have meant admitting that what he'd framed as moral clarity had actually cost him standing. His marriage reflected this strain most clearly. The unity he'd worked so hard to protect began fracturing under pressure. Disagreements intensified, not about me, but about control, about responsibility, about who was carrying more. And without external buffers, those conflicts turned inward. My son sounded defensive more often, his wife more impatient, and neither of them seemed to realize that the loss they were experiencing wasn't caused by opposition. It was caused by exposure to the limits of their own decision. I noticed how often my son spoke about feeling alone now, isolated in ways he hadn't expected, and the irony wasn't lost on me. He'd removed someone from his life to avoid feeling torn, and in doing so, he'd narrowed his world to a point where every strain landed directly on him. The support he'd assumed would remain quietly available had been reclassified, and reclassified roles don't automatically revert. Especially when the reclassification was unilateral, his wife responded to the growing instability by asserting more control, managing narratives more aggressively, correcting perceptions before they fully formed. But that effort only accelerated the loss, because control is most visible when it's no longer trusted, and trust, once strained, rarely returns on command. I heard about arguments with friends, about distance from relatives, about people who didn't understand them anymore, and again, I stayed silent, not because I lacked compassion, but because this wasn't something reassurance could fix. It was structural. The loss of standing continued quietly, cumulative rather than explosive. My son noticed he was no longer consulted in the same way, no longer deferred to instinctively, and that bruised him deeply, because authority that's assumed is comforting, but authority that must be earned is exhausting. And he was tired, not just physically, but existentially. Tired of justifying, tired of defending, tired of holding together something that no longer felt stable. And if you're listening right now, understand this. People don't usually regret choices because of emotional pain. They regret them because of what those choices cost them in function, in ease, in influence, and that cost was becoming undeniable. I could see it in how cautiously he approached conversations now, how measured his words were, how often he seemed to be scanning for reactions, because once credibility cracks, people become hyper-aware of how they're perceived, and that awareness is draining. My son didn't come to me to admit this. He couldn't. Doing so would have meant acknowledging that the person he'd sidelined had been part of what sustained him, and that realization was still too close to failure to face directly. Instead, he circled, checking in without committing, hinting at reconnecting without addressing why disconnection had happened, and I remained consistent, polite, distant, not to punish, but because consistency is the only response that matches clarity, and clarity is what he'd forced into existence with his declaration. The most telling loss, though, wasn't social or professional. It was internal. The quiet confidence he'd once had in his own judgment eroded, replaced by doubt he couldn't share openly, because doubt contradicts certainty, and certainty had been the foundation of his choice. And if you stay with me, you'll see how that erosion led him to a crossroads he never anticipated, where the only way forward would require confronting not me, not his wife, but the version of himself he'd become comfortable defending, a confrontation far more difficult than choosing sides ever was. The decision I made wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with announcements or ultimatums. And if you're still listening right now, understand this. It wasn't about cutting anyone off. It was about finally structuring my life around reality instead of hope. Once I saw clearly what my son had chosen and what that choice revealed, I stopped waiting for things to return to a version that no longer existed. I met quietly with people who understood how these situations unfold, not to escalate, not to retaliate, but to ensure that my independence didn't depend on anyone else's comfort or approval. Boundaries that had once been emotional became practical. Access that had once been assumed became intentional. I clarified decision-making authority, not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. Because when someone has shown you they're willing to sideline you for convenience, it's not bitterness to prepare accordingly. It's wisdom. I didn't inform my son immediately, not because I was hiding anything, but because my life no longer required his validation, and explanations would have invited debate where none was needed. He noticed the changes gradually, processes that took longer, questions redirected, assumptions no longer rewarded. And when he finally asked, cautiously, whether I was distancing myself, I answered honestly that I was organizing my life in a way that reflected how our relationship now functioned, not how it once had, and that answer ended the conversation, because there was nothing accusatory in it, nothing to defend against. It was simply accurate. Our contact settled into something minimal, respectful, contained, and in that containment, I felt lighter, not relieved in a triumphant way, but steady, because I was no longer managing expectations that weren't mine to manage. I wasn't bracing for exclusion or interpreting silence. I was living, making decisions without calculating whether my presence would create tension. And that freedom didn't come from winning or losing. It came from alignment. The alignment between how I was treated and how I responded. And as I settled into that alignment, I understood something that surprised me. Letting go of the need to be chosen didn't diminish me. It clarified me, and clarity, once established, doesn't require reinforcement. It simply holds. So this is where my story ends. Not with reconciliation, not with an apology that magically fixes everything, but with clarity that no longer bends. My son believed choosing his wife meant setting a priority, but what he actually did was give up a relationship he assumed would always be there, no matter how little he protected it. I didn't fight him. I didn't demand to be chosen, because love that has to compete has already lost its meaning. And if you're still listening right now, pause for a moment and ask yourself this. How many people are being quietly pushed aside in the name of peace? How many parents are being told to understand while their presence is treated like a burden? I didn't disappear to punish anyone. I stepped back to preserve myself, and in doing so, I learned something powerful. When someone tells you they can't keep choosing you, believe them and choose yourself instead. If this story made you uncomfortable, angry, or painfully seen, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and whether you've ever been made to feel optional by someone you loved. Share this with someone who needs to hear that boundaries aren't betrayal, and subscribe if you want more real stories about dignity, consequences, and what happens when silence is finally replaced with self-respect. Because peace that requires your disappearance was never peace at all. It was convenience dressed up as loyalty.